lesson, we're going to look at the second part of our ecosystem notes. So remember last time we spent talking about what an ecosystem is and looking at how nutrients are recycled in an ecosystem through the biogeochemical cycles. I wanted to start back at this slide from last time to remember that ecosystems are self-sufficient and that they have two main inputs. One is energy, which comes from the sun and flows through our ecosystem. And the other one is our nutrients. And we already talked about nutrients last time, that cycle in our ecosystem through the biogeochemical cycles. So today, we're going to focus on the energy input. What does it mean for energy to flow through an ecosystem? And how does it do so? So energy flows through an ecosystem. What we mean by that is that the sun is the ultimate source of all energy for every ecosystem. It is captured or turned into energy that can be contained in the chemical bonds within organic material by producers, plants. We talked about how they go through photosynthesis, and in the photosystems, the light-dependent reactions, they capture that energy and they turn it into energy or they turn it into energy that's contained in high energy electrons. From our plants, that energy is transferred to primary consumers or herbivores when those organisms eat the plants. And likewise, the energy contained in the primary consumers, the herbivores, can be passed on to carnivores or secondary consumers when they eat the herbivores. This is what's meant by energy flowing through the ecosystem. It starts from the sun and moves through different components of our ecosystem. One important thing I want to mention here is that how in each step of that energy transfer from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, some of that energy that was available at the previous level is lost. And that is an important concept that we're going to talk about more specifically later. What we can do now that we have a rudimentary understanding about how energy flows through an ecosystem is we can describe it in terms of food chains. So food chains represent the feeding relationships in a linear way in an ecosystem. And we kind of separate the food chain, things on top versus the things on the bottom. Things on top eat the things on the bottom, and the things on the bottom are eaten by things on the top. Each level or rung, rather, in this food chain is called a trophic level. So, energy, remember, ultimately starts from the sun, and then it goes to our first trophic level, which are plants. All right, they are producers. In this example, this food chain has 4 levels. 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually, because of that lost energy, that inefficiency of energy transfer between the levels in a food chain that we mentioned earlier, food chains can never really get more than 4 or 5 levels big. So we'll start at the producers, and it'll flow to the primary consumers, the secondary consumers. In a 4-level food chain, we have tertiary consumers, or our top carnivores, and so this would be a simple food chain, our 4 trophic levels right here. We don't consider it one of the levels, but we also include decomposers in our food chain because ultimately the energy would be trapped in these organisms if they were not broken down, their organic matter was broken down and returned to the soil again once they died by the decomposers, the fungi and the bacteria. Okay. Now let's talk about that inefficiency of energy transfer. So there is a major loss in energy between levels of the food chain. So for example, the amount of energy that plants capture for the sun is more than the energy that is available to our herbivores that eat the plants. There's some energy that's lost in that transferring from producers to primary consumers. And we're going to talk about why that is. So here we have a primary consumer, this beetle here, and it's eating a producer, a leaf. And that leaf gets some energy from the sun, and then the bug, the beetle, eats that leaf. How much energy is left over for that bug that was originally present in the leaf after we discount the loss of energy because of inefficient energy transfer? Well, 50% of the energy from that leaf isn't absorbed and is just excreted as waste in the feces of that beetle. Gone, can't even be used. 33 additional percent of that energy available in the leaf is just goes to keeping that beetle in homeostasis. Just its daily living. Only 17% of that original energy in this example that was originally present in that leaf actually goes into growth, making new bonds in the organism of the beetle. So a large majority of that energy is lost. It isn't stored within that organism, which would then be available to our secondary consumers. Only that 17% is able to move on to support the next trophic level. So another way we can look at that idea of loss of energy between food levels in a food chain, or loss of energy between the trophic levels in a food chain, is by making an ecological or energy pyramid. And it looks like this. Because there is more and more energy lost as we go up the trophic levels, you can feed fewer and fewer animals of each level. That's why you're always going to have far fewer snakes than mice, and far fewer mice than grasshoppers, and far fewer grasshoppers than flowers. Because less energy is available, there are fewer organisms that can be present in our ecosystem from that trophic level. The other thing that you should notice, now that I have these numbers populated in here, is how the energy decreases between each level. Let's notice the difference between each level. So if we start out with, here at the bottom, 1 billion joules of energy. Once we get to the next trophic level, we only have 100,000. When we get to the next, there's only 100. And when we get to the top, there's 1. So 1 joule of this original billion makes it up this far. Okay? That isn't an exaggeration, all right? Most of the energy, all right, 90% of the energy is lost from one trophic level to the next. Only about 10% ever really make it to the next trophic level. And what that implies when we look at our own lives and our own carbon footprint is really startling. So the dynamics of energy through ecosystems have important implications for our own human population. How much energy does it take to feed a human if we are meat eaters or if we're vegetarians? Let's look at these two food chains. So if we subsist mainly on animal flesh, we're mainly carnivores. Think about how much corn in this case we would need, because now the available energy in the corn is reduced by 2 orders of magnitude to get to humans. So we need many more cattle to feed us, and because of that, we need twice as much, or not twice as much, but 100 times the amount of corn, since we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude to feed us. On the other hand, if we subsist mainly on plants, there is only one place in which energy is lost between us and our food source. 1 order of magnitude. So we would need far less corn in this case to allow us to survive to feed ourselves if we ate it directly versus if we ate primary consumers. Something to think about when we're talking about reducing our carbon footprint. The last thing that I'm going to talk about are food webs. So food chains are linked together into food webs. Food chains are really linear and don't really tell or don't really accurately represent how feeding relationships happen in an ecosystem, so food webs are a lot more realistic. They basically show who is eaten by whom, what organisms are eaten by what other organisms in a given ecosystem. So a species may weave into a web at more than one level. So an organism might be at more than one level in a food web. So for example, the, let me see, the squid here feeds on herbivorous plankton, but it is also feeds on fish. So in this case, it is both a primary and a secondary consumer. Most food webs will not have organisms that are only one thing. And this is a lot more realistic, a lot more complex of a depiction of a relationship than we could make in a complete linear food chain. So when we talk about that, let's take a look at what would happen if we removed something in a food chain. So if, for example, because of overfishing, we would have a drastic decrease in fish. Think about how that would affect all other organisms in the food web. And this is my last and kind of most important point about this. There's no way to affect only one organism in an isolation, or one group of organisms, one species in a food web in isolation, because everything in the food web, either directly or distantly, is interdependent. And that is what we as humans forget a lot of the time.